Hi, James and Mitchell here, and in this video we're going to be doing another look with the Lenormand with the Grand Tableau, and this is my second one, so if you missed the first one I'll put a link to the first one in the description box below. And this is going to be different in a couple of ways. If you watched that first video, then you know that that reading was about me, something that I was going through, and it was in response to a couple of viewers in particular who wanted to see my process for doing a Grand Tableau. So that was the motivation for it. So that video was one of my longest videos to date. It was an hour long. So two reasons why this video is going to be different is, number one, I am not the subject of the video. It's actually a good friend of mine who I was talking about my experience with the cards and how I wanted to get more experience reading for other people, and he volunteered to be a guinea pig for me to work on my Grand Tableau for another person. So he was also okay with me presenting it as a video series. And so notice what I said series, so that's the second change. I'm always trying to keep the content on this channel fresh and interesting, both for me and for you as the viewer, and I'm always trying to be cognizant of how much time a video is in terms of length. So when I made that first video for an hour long, after I uploaded, I felt really good about it. Then I uploaded and I thought, who's going to really sit and watch it for an entire hour? I know I would, because it's something that's interesting to me, but I really did have that thought. And so this video series is going to be different in that regard. It's going to be broken up into parts, and so because I'm trying to be aware of how much time you are investing in every video of mine that you're watching, and so I'm noticing that when I do my weekly videos, they are starting to run on the longer side. So I'm trying to be aware of that and trying to say, oh, how can I work with that? Because that's just my style. You know, I can't fault my style. It's just is what it is. But in terms of being on the receiving end of that as a viewer, I'm trying to say, so maybe I'm just playing with that to see how that would go over this time. So in this particular video, we're going to be exploring the background. So the next segment, I'll be explaining about the background of Howard. That's my friend who volunteered to have this video series done on him and his situation. So we'll be looking at the background, and then we'll be going right to the table. I have the cards laid out already, and we'll be looking at what the overall impression that I got in the moment when the cards were first laid out. So stay tuned. Okay, so now a little bit of background about my friend Howard and his situation. So Howard is an Akashic Records consultant, and for those of you who might not be aware of what that is, the Akashic Records are said to be the book of life, and everyone has his or her life story recorded in the books. And so what an ARC does is that they provide the space for a person to have a conversation with the record keepers about information that may be useful or helpful or meaningful for them at the time that they have the session done about whatever experience that they bring to the table. So that's what Howard is, and he's serving in that role. He actually is a level 1 trained ARC, and so that pretty much means that you read the records for yourself. When you become a level 2, is that then you start providing that service for other people. You have the ability to access the records of other people. So that's what he is actively engaged in doing right now. But when I saw him and we were talking about that, he was feeling a sense of being lost. Lost was the word he used, and I so can relate to that. But he's experiencing like a decline in interest in what it is that he's doing and trying in terms of trying to get his service out there for people to have an experience of. He's finding it to be a challenge, finding interested parties, you know, that kind of thing. So it, you know, and I get that, you know, he's in a space now where it's happening long enough for him to start questioning whether that's what he should be doing, and that kind of thing. You know, and I think anybody who is self-employed to any degree. We all go through it at certain stages and times in the growth of our business. You know, I know for myself that when I left my corporate job for a great period of time, when business was slow, I was in that space of like, am I doing the right thing? Did I make a poor choice? Yeah. Did I get it wrong in terms of guidance from the universe? Did I get it wrong? You know, that kind of thing. You know, and then if you let it linger long enough or it festers long enough, you can start eroding away at your sense of self-worth and the value in what it is, because you're passionate about it. So then it makes you question the value of it being for other people. So I totally can relate to that, because Howard's kind of in that space. So, you know, I talked about, you know, my work with the Lenormand, you know, and talked about the videos and, you know, how I'm finding that I'm growing, you know, and developing as a reader. And so even though he's working with his guides on a regular basis, which is what an Akashic Records consultant should be doing, he was also open to the idea of looking to see what the Lenormand might have to say about his experience. So he was willing to do that. So that's what this video series is going to be about. So we kind of framed it around the question of like, what does he need to know about this sense of being lost, and how can he move through it? And where the direction of his ARC is going, you know, where's the business taking him. So those are kind of the things we were looking at. So in this next segment, it's going to be looking at the cards that showed up in the tableau, and I'm just offering in that segment what my overall impressions are, with the intention of, I want to honor both Lisa and Michelle and Laura, because Laura was actually the one who kind of set things up with wanting to know about reading the card and the house and how do you do that. And then when I presented that video, Michelle and Lisa were very interested in looking more deeply at the houses. So I'm hoping that I kind of tick off all the boxes here in this overall impression. And then in the following videos in the series, we'll be looking at each one of the steps in my process going forward. So having said that, this next segment, like I said, is going to be the overall impression, so stay tuned. Okay, and here we are. The cards have been laid out in the Grand Tableau that I used when Howard and I were discussing his situation. So first, let me say that the Grand Tableau that's being used in this video is similar to the one that I used in the previous video, but I didn't mention it by name. This particular one is called the 8x4 plus 4, because there are 4 rows of 8 cards, and then the essence line, which consists of the remaining 4 cards. This is my particular favorite. And the reason why I like it is because I like the idea of having the 4 cards at the bottom to form what I call like the fate line, the destiny line, the essence line, and it kind of punctuates the tableau with like a final piece of advice. The other one that you could use would be the 9x4, and instead of having the 4 cards at the bottom, you would have 4 rows of 9 cards. You know, I've tried them both, and I particularly like this one. So a lot of the things that I offer in this video will just be for your consideration. If you actually like working with the 9x4, most of the things that I'll be talking about would fit in the same way. The other thing that I want to talk about, because I'm going to be talking in this particular segment of the video when I give my initial impressions, when I first laid out the cards for Howard, is that the house systems. There are 2 different house systems that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are more, but there are 2 that I'm aware of. And so the one that I use, and one that I'm most comfortable with right now, is called the Game of Hope house system. And the meanings of the houses are closely related to what the actual card would mean. And so since I'm just starting out with Lenormand, I'm most comfortable with that. It kind of reinforces what the cards mean for me in particular, so that's another reason why I like using it. The other house system that I know about is called the Master House system, and in that one, the houses have different meanings than they would for the cards themselves. So you know, I'm a big believer in trying all the different ways to find the way that works best for you. Like I said, in this particular case, I'm more comfortable with the Game of Hope house system, so that's what I will be speaking from. So having said that, the deck that we're using for this reading is the Mystical Lenormand, and it is by Regula Elizabeth Fiechter, and it has the artwork by Trösch. Again, that's a Mystical Lenormand. Okay, so what I usually do when I start off with a Grand Tableau, I look to see where the significator card is. And so in this particular case, for Howard, being male, I looked for where the gentleman card was first. And so if you notice, the gentleman card is here in row 3. So everything that is to the left of the gentleman is the past. And if you notice, so this row here, or this column rather, is Howard's present. And then the column over here to the right is his future. So there's not much here to talk about in terms of the future. There's a lot of material that is devoted to the past. So, but this is still going to be very key to use. Now, if, for instance, if the gentleman was over here in the last row and there would be no future, I would make a note of that, and then I would take up the cards and reshuffle them and lay out the tableau again, because most people, when they're coming to have a reading done, no matter what the oracle that's being used is, they want some guidance or insight or direction about how to move forward. And if there's no row here for the future, you're kind of stuck. So, but I'm still going to work with this because I found it very interesting in light of Howard's situation. And remember now, when Howard and I were talking, he was feeling a sense of being lost in terms of his work as an Akashic Records consultant. Now, Howard is, you know, just embarking on that. He's at level 2 in his stage of development with the Akashic Records, and so he's been actively trying to get people to, you know, partake in his services, you know, to have an experience of that, and he's been having some difficulty with that. And so he is like me in this regard. Is like when you are so closely identified with your work and a lot of work is not coming in, or you're not getting to do a lot of that, it can kind of weigh on your sense of identity and your sense of value, and the value you as a person possibly, and what it is you have to offer to the world. And I say that in light of the way that the cards fell. You know, I'm a big believer in there's no mistakes in the way the cards show up, and so in this particular case, they were very revealing. So starting with the gentleman again, it's in the house of the mice. So when I looked at that, the first thing I said to Howard for his consideration was that the card in this position was suggesting that he was at a point where he was feeling stress and worried about this, that it was eating away at him and gnawing at him, you know, and not so much like in one big instant or moment, but over a period of time. And he acknowledged that, and the reason why I'm saying that is because those are all the attributes of the mice card for me. And so let me talk a little bit about this, and this might help Laura, who asked in the previous Grand Tableau video about how to read that. So I always tend to look at the card being the constant. It's always going to be what the card is. It changes the energy of it based on the space that the card is occupying. And that's how I look at the houses. I look at them as energetic spaces that the card itself is occupying. And so based on that space, it's going to take on a different layer of meaning. Now, if you were to read the cards without the houses, that would be one way, but looking at what house it's in offers a deeper or a more nuanced meaning or aspect to the reading. So Howard did acknowledge that yes, he was feeling stressed out and worried about, you know, the seemingly decline in, you know, people being interested in what he was doing with his work with the Akashic Records. So I took note of that. And then I noticed right above the gentleman was the clouds. And so now the clouds is a challenging card, but it also can represent being confused, being bewildered, being uncertain, being unsure, having a sense of doubt. And but what I love about the way that the cards were laid out is that it's right above the gentleman, which means like this is on his mind. And that is exactly what he brought to the table, no pun intended, when we were talking about it. He was feeling this sense of like uncertainty and not being sure and having lots of doubt. So I just love how the two cards lined up and they perfectly match his situation. So now going one step up, looking at the clouds is in the house of the bear. And so, you know, that could be, you know, confusion about one's strength, like, you know, getting to the point where we're doubting our strength. You know, we all have our strengths and our weaknesses and things. And so, you know, Howard has gotten to the point now where he's probably doubting his strength as an Akashic Records consultant because of the space that he's currently in about, you know, the sense of stress and worry about it and the gradual decline of interest that it seems that he is finding himself in. So I love that. So this is how I would read the clouds in the house of the bear. It's like, you know, doubt and uncertainty about his strength as an Akashic Records consultant, and also maybe, you know, doubt and uncertainty about, you know, going to the next level, because the bear also represents, you know, the boss or the authority, you know, a person of influence. So if he's, you know, experiencing this now at the level he's at, it may cause him to kind of question whether he wants to move up to the next level or not. And then right next to the clouds, we have the mice. And so since the gentleman is in the house of the mice, this is very interesting to look, because now the mice is going to be in his portrait or his box. And so we'll be looking at that in a later video. But here right now, the mice being a sense of stress and worry, you know, a decline, you know, a sense of loss, it's in the house of the stars. And so the stars for me represents inspiration, it represents guidance, it represents direction. And is it any wonder if he's feeling lost, then he has no sense of direction, or there's a gradual decline in the sense of direction that he is going to be moving in or wants to move in, pertaining to the Akashic Records and being an Akashic Records consultant. The other thing about this card, the mice being in the house of the stars, for me represents the gradual decline or loss of inspiration. That the longer that this goes on for him, the greater chances are, because now remember, this is the road of the future, the greater the chance that this erosion of inspiration might continue. So I noticed that. Very interesting how these three cards laid out. So now, having said that, since we looked at the cards around the man, then the next thing I do is I look for the actual card that's in the house of the gentleman. And so here we have the scythe. And so I was a little worried when I saw the scythe, because the scythe can sometimes represent like injury. It can represent pain, something that's hurtful. You know, so the first thing I thought of is like, it could be in terms of something that's causing Howard pain. And I looked to this card, the clouds again. One of the other aspects of the clouds could be a sense of like feeling overcast or downcast, even maybe some depression. And so how could that be painful to him? You know, and so I was concerned about that. You know, so I offered the idea, like, if there was a possibility that if he was depressed, would he consider maybe seeing someone and talking to someone about that? Because I'm not a medical professional, so I can't prescribe him and I can't diagnose him as being depressed, but the possibility could be there. And so that might be something that he might want to explore, especially with the scythe being in his house, the house of the gentleman. Another thing about the scythe being in that house could be, you know, what could he cut out or what could he eliminate that would help him move forward? Because the thing about the scythe card can represent a process of removal or elimination, but it can also represent a swift course of action, you know, or doing something unexpectedly, something of that nature. So I'm looking, and the immediate thing that I notice here would be that the first thing here that he could cut out would be to stop beating himself up, because the whip is the card that's next to the scythe, and the blade of the scythe is pointing to the whip. And so usually we go with the idea that wherever the direction of the blade is pointing is the thing that would need to be removed or considered for removal. And so it would be like, how can he cut out the activity of beating himself up? Because on some level that may be playing into the depression, that might be playing into the uncertainty that he's beating himself up. And so I offered him that for consideration, and he did say that he is, you know, in that space where he's beating himself up. But now, in the positive sense, these two cards could be asking him to consider what would he need to cut out or remove, maybe that's excessive, that would help him become more disciplined. It could just suggest that he might need more discipline or more training in what it is that he's doing with the Akashic Records. And so I also offered him that in this particular case, this card could suggest, on the negative side, beating himself up, but on the positive side, what kind of training might he need so he could better become more disciplined, or just increase his level of being disciplined in the records, that kind of thing. So I looked at that. So then once we do that, I looked at his card, looked to see what house, what card is in his house. Then I look for, the topic card would be, in this case, him being an Akashic Records consultant. There are kind of several ways we could move around this. We could look at the idea with the book, and the book is in the top row, the book being the actual Akashic Records themselves. So it's in the house of the house. And so this is something that I look at as talking about Howard's business, because he works from home, and so that's his home-based business. It's also his small business, so that makes perfect sense seeing the book in the house of the house for me. The idea here I would also offer for Howard for his consideration, and I believe I did say this in our conversation, would be the house sometimes for me can be about our brand. And so anybody who is a business owner of any kind has a brand. So it could be, out of all the Akashic Records consultants that are out there doing the same thing that Howard is doing, what is it about the way he accesses the records that sets him apart? Just like everybody who's watching this video, if you're into Lenormand, we all have a way of reading the cards that sets us all apart. So, consider what would be your brand. I'm always asking, like, okay, what's my brand? What is the thing that makes me me in terms of how I present the Lenormand, both in these videos and to my own personal clients? So I offered that for Howard's consideration, asking him to consider what is his brand in terms of being an ARC. And the other thing would be, I look at the house as something we do in our own, personal lives, our own home lives. So, one of the things that may be helping him with the discipline, which is a nice dovetail since I just talked about that, would be making sure that he's actively reading the records for himself, maybe on a daily basis, to kind of create some form of routine. So I would offer that to him too as something for him to look at. Now the next thing that jumps out at me, and this is again going with the initial impressions, right next to the book in the house of the tree we have the key. So the key always represents for me something that is true, something that is certain. And so in this particular case, this is the truth of his situation. Regardless of how it looks, he is growing and developing as an Akashic Records consultant because it's in the house of the tree. And for me, the tree represents growth and development. So I'm seeing that. That's a positive sign right there. So another thing I would look at is, since this is his business, we could actually look to see a couple of business related cards. So we could look to see where the house is, which is right here. And so this is house 16, 17, 18. Also, okay, this is in the house of the dog, so this is great. So this would be, for me, reading the dog as energy of, in terms of a profession, this is actually the house of the consultant. I tend to look at, the dog, professionally speaking, as an advisor or consultant. And Howard has this in his title. He's an Akashic Records consultant. So I think that's beautiful. I think it's just, again, kind of saying, what sets you apart? What makes you you? Because the house in this regard is being comfortable with who you are. So being comfortable, being himself, being comfortable as an Akashic Records consultant. But even with that, how would you spin that? How would you sell that? What is it about you that makes you you? And be comfortable with that. So I'm looking at that. The other thing that I would look at would be, the idea of being an entrepreneur. And so right here, I'm looking at the fish. The fish, for me, represents entrepreneur card. It also represents the ability to make money doing what it is that we do. And this is lovely because it's in the house of the ring. So, one of the things is that, being committed to this process, this experience, this situation, being committed as an entrepreneur. So I see that. And it could also just be a reminder for Howard about, making sure that he's being financially compensated and that he's being paid for the service that he provides, because I see this as, financial commitments, going with the fish being financial, and in the house of the ring being commitments or contracts, things of that nature. And so moving on from there, the other thing I wanted to consider would be, his audience. And so for me, I look at the garden card because the garden card represents other people, it represents groups, it represents community. So in this case, it could represent audience. So if you notice, the garden card here is in the bottom row of the 4 cards. So it's considered out of tableau. So it could be that his audience, just looking at the way it's falling into the layout, his audience is not really aware of what it is that he does. They may not have enough of a working knowledge of what the Akashic Records are, what an Akashic Records consultant does, what the process is, things of that nature, because I always see this as, being on the outside of the big picture. So they may not totally get what it is that he's trying to do, or the process even. So might want to consider that. The other thing is that I'm looking at this and it's fallen into the house of the key. So again, this is about, I see this 2 ways. Number one, in terms of audience, that Howard is still on a mission to discover who his actual audience is, and he will arrive there. But for me, because I always look at the key as discovering something, so it's a process of discovery. So he's still in the process of discovering who his audience is and who would best need to have an Akashic Records consult. So I'm seeing that. The other thing is, if we consider that the process of being an Akashic Records consultant is actually consulting with the masters who are the record keepers of the Akashic Records, then we could look at the garden card as being the guides, being the actual record keepers, and it would make total sense with them being out of tableau because they're not in the physical world. So they're a little bit removed from the situation. So I'm seeing that, and I thought that was perfect. And so we totally got excited about the idea of looking at that as being the guides and the masters, the record keepers. And in that particular case, then, his guides are saying how important it is that he's doing this work, again, because it's in the house of the key. And the other thing is that his guides are asking him, with this card in this position, to that their process, that their work that they're doing is revealing the messages that need to be revealed, the messages that are important for the person on the receiving end. So they're letting him know again that the work he's doing is important, and so he has to remember that. And he probably would remember that more often than not is if he was in communication with his guides on a regular basis. And so that would be actually accessing his records regularly, going with the idea back to the book being in the house of the house. So those were the initial things that I saw in his reading, and so I hope that was helpful for both Laura and Michelle. Laura being that this was just a way to kind of gain some idea of how to work the card and the house combination. And for Michelle, I hope you appreciated looking at some aspects of the reading just from the place of the card and the house that it's in. Okay, so in the next segment of this series, I will be looking at my process step by step. And so in the next video, we're going to be looking at what are the first 3 cards in this reading trying to offer Howard in terms of information about his being an Akashic Records consultant. So stay tuned for that.